Our layout tonight is presented by Barry Dupler. Barry is a close neighbor almost. He lives in Redmond, which is slightly east and north of Bellevue, Washington. Barry grew up in Salt Lake City, and as a youngster, he, like a lot of us, got involved with American Flyer trains, and then he moved on to HO with the Markland layout. When he went out to college, he did something probably some of us thought about doing. He packed not only his books and clothing and all that, but he packed a Z-scale layout in a suitcase just to make sure that his spare time was occupied. He went to the University of Colorado, and while there, he volunteered at the Colorado Railroad Museum and spent quite a bit of time there. And then he got involved with the Heber Creeper, which is a railroad in that area. Often he would spend time with the guys in the bunkhouse. And one of the guys working as a young mechanic there was a fellow by the name of Doug Jolly, who we will see in Salt Lake. When he married Janice, they moved into the east side, but they couldn't initially have room for a layout. So they got involved with 7.5-inch gauge live steam. And they have a 10-wheeler, which they still run occasionally at kids have live steamers, and I suspect down at Train Mountain. One of the things about Barry and Janice is that they are intensely interested in railroads and the beautiful scenery and so on, but they've become a little competitive in the dealing with scenery and the photography. And we'll let Barry comment about the results of some of those contests. Barry's going to describe his layout, which is dual gauge, HO. So we'll turn it over to our presenter tonight.
Thanks for your kind words. Let me bring up my presentation. Welcome to the railroad. As was mentioned, I'm calling it the South Park branch. I actually have two railroads on the layout. The first is the South Park, which is a hypothetical branch of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. It's an HO3 layout. The other railroad I have is the standard gauge logging railroad. I was torn between whether I wanted to do logging or whether I wanted to do narrow gauge, and so I decided to do both. And so I'll show you today what I came up with. The railroad, the standard gauge is a loop-to-loop railroad. I'll show you a track plan in a few minutes. The narrow gauge is actually point-to-point, but I do have some loops for continuous running. It's all hand-laid track. My wife Janice has volunteered to cut all of the ties for it, which was a pretty big job. There's a fair amount of track. I have a mix of scratch-built and fast-track turnouts. I use the DCC NCE control system. I have a mix of the layout started about 18 years ago, and so I started out with tortoises, and I've now moved to servos. So I've got a mix of switch engines, but I'm trying to control them all with Cam Valley so that when you're running it, it all looks like the same types of controls. The layout is in a bonus room over my garage, and it's approximately 12 by 26 feet. The terrain is hydrocal over pink foam. So when I designed my railroad, I really wanted to do mountain railroad. And when you do mountain railroading, you want to have a lot of grades. I was influenced by John Allen. And so I do have some pretty good grades on my railroad. I'm not afraid of small trains and, doubling up and using helpers if I need to. So I tried to design a long and winding track plan just because of the terrain differences I wanted to have. I also wanted to try to fit in multiple towns and destinations, so I had a reason to run from point to point to point. I wanted to have continuous running. And another goal I had is, since I'm running two different railroads on the same layout, basically, I wanted to try to provide some visual separation between them. So if you wanted to focus on the narrow gauge, you could, or if you wanted to focus on the logging, you could. I'll show you the results of that in a few minutes. I've been trying to model industrial chains. So, I've got logging to sawmills to manufacturing. I've got mines to smelters to stamp mills to foundries to try to generate some operations. I haven't got to that point yet, but I'd like to do that. And I specifically have tried to highlight some of the key structures on my layout. When I started building it, I really discovered my love of structures building. And I actually changed the track plan partway through, and I'll talk about that, to try to highlight some of the structures on my layout. And a good example of that, I'll show you in a few minutes, is the sawmill that I did in trying to give better visibility of it. So this is where it all started, the room that the layout is located in. It's a bonus room. It's got some big dormer windows, and there's not really any long, flat walls to build up against. I designed the whole thing on a 3D printing system and printed them out full size that I use for laying out my track. The picture in the middle is one, the first time we laid it out in the room, and this is just a small part of the layout, South Park. That's Janice and a friend of mine, Edward Richards, who was helping me at the time, and we were just kind of flabbergasted about how big this thing would be when you actually looked at it. So I started building the bench work. One of the things is I did have the house remodeled to add more space to the layout room. And when I got it all done, Janice read me the Riot Act and said, I can't screw up the room. And she said, I don't want you to have your layout touch any of the walls. So I had to build the whole layout freestanding. The original part of the layout that you can see me standing by is the town of South Park that I'll show you in a few minutes. It actually has a fair number of grades in the yard area up in here, but I built the whole thing flat. And then when I got it built, I took a jigsaw and basically cut it apart and put the grades in. So a little bit different than I think a lot of people have done. So this is basically the layout of the layout. And we'll talk about the different areas. The main town that we'll be starting from is the town of Eureka. We have a mining district, a Highline district. There's a logging area, and then there's the town of South Park down in the bottom. I've got a upper level over Eureka that is going to be the town of Vail that we'll talk about shortly. This is what the room looks like. The sawmill, Eureka, and Vail are on the left side. The mountain district is that unbuilt benchwork that you see in the center of the picture. And then the Highline and the logging and South Park are on the peninsula on the right. This is a Highline area. And this is the South Park area. The South Park is the oldest part of the layout, and that's where it all started from. And you can see there's some pretty good grade differences in the town, but this is the area that I talked about. I built it all flat and then basically cut between the tracks and then added support underneath to put the grades in. This is the track plan for the standard gauge logging railroad. In the lower left-hand corner, we have the sawmill with a log pond, and there's a loop of track going around it. To the left are some storage and passing tracks. To the right side are the railroad shop area. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. The track goes up a helix to an upper level and then down through the unbuilt, unscenic, I should say, mountain area, mining area, and then into the Highline. And in the center here, we have a logging camp and the logging loading area. this is the sawmill. It's a CROS kit. It's kind of the centerpiece of the railroad. When I originally designed the layout, it was going to go in the corner of the room that you can kind of see where those pictures are in the upper corner. And it would have only been visible really from two sides of it. And it'd have a sloped ceiling over it. And when I started building the sawmill, I realized that you really can't shove this into the corner. And so I stuck it literally right in the middle of the room and put a big peninsula, so you could view it from all sides. Here's another view. I don't know how many of you have seen the kit. It was the sawmill won first place, not mine, but some others who were done by Mike Engler and others, won first place in a couple of the national narrow gauge conventions and other contests. It's a really neat looking building. So that's basically the four sides of it. And I mean, from every direction, it's just, it like I say, is it warranted being viewed from putting it in the middle of the room and making a kind of the showpiece of it. To the right are a couple other Sierra West kits. These are warehouses for the logging company. And in the log pond, you can see there's a dynamite shack and there's some other buildings associated with the mill itself. This is the logging unloading area at the log pond. This is the shop area for the logging railroad. I located it adjacent to the sawmill. It kind of made for a large peninsula. I violated the 3-foot rule by a long shot, but I wanted to try to have them grouped together because you would naturally find them in close proximity. And so in order to access all of the scenery and everything, there's a large lift out in the middle of the layout to access everything. The buildings that you can see, these are all primarily Sierra West kits. They're the logging camp essentials, railroad camp, the Eureka Springs engine house. Here's another view. One of the things I really like about the Sierra West kits is there's a lot of different texture, color, and materials. I wanted to model in the 1930s and the Depression and everything is a little bit seedy and run down. And these kits really lent themselves to that. A lot of these kits all have interiors. And so I've modeled the interiors in all cases. Many of them are board-on-board construction. As you can see here, this is the tractor and logging repair shed. And they're lit, as you can see, to try to provide visibility of the inside of the buildings. When you leave the sawmill area, you go up the incline, or not the incline, excuse me, the helix, and run down to the end of the building through the mining district. I'm not showing that because it's not scenic. And then you come into the Highline area. And this is the scenery that the train comes into. So the track for the logging railroad comes right behind these houses, between these houses and barns, and up into the forest area. The backdrops I just put up fairly recently. I took a lot of photographs Colorado with the intention of doing backdrops. But when it came time to try to do this part of the layout, I didn't have anything that would really fit. So what I did is I took 8 different photographs of 8 different areas that I liked and photoshopped them together. And I ended up with a 16-foot backdrop that I think does a pretty credible job of blending it all together. I had a little bit of help. We have some experts in the area on doing photo backdrops that you're probably well aware of. And I got Dale to help me do these. So I have a few trees on here that I picked up from Paul Scholes. And so I had to, in his honor, we have the Scholes National Forest, as you can see on the right. This is the Black Mountain Logging Camp. This is located on basically the upper part of the Highline Peninsula. These kits, again, are Sierra West. I've done some modification of them and tried to, I had to build some pilings and stuff to put them up on. I got intrigued with putting the idea of a logging camp in a very rugged mountainous area. This is another view of the logging camp. And I was just really thrilled with the backdrop when I put it up. This is the logging loading area. One of the things that I have done in a number of places on my layout is try to use forced perspective. The area that you're looking at is only a couple feet across. It's the inner loop of a loop track that's probably 24-inch radius, so it's not that big of area. The donkey engine that's in the upper right-hand side is an N-scale donkey. The trees behind it are actually the top of the trees behind the logging camp, the bunkhouses. The bunkhouses are just on the other side of the hill here. And by just showing the top of those trees, it makes them look like, they're much smaller than what they are on the other side. Now, one of the things, though, is when you stick something like that, N gauge, you put it out there, it was really hard to tell that it was small and it was not the same scale as the rest of the layout being N scale. So what I did is I built the same donkey engine in HO and put it here in the foreground so that these are not very far apart, but the fact that you had 2 identical pieces of equipment, one in HO and one in N scale, gave better visual communication of the fact that it's, forced perspective. If I'd not had that bigger piece, I don't think you would have had the forced perspective, because you have no idea whether that's a big donkey engine or a little one sitting up on the hillside. Here's another view of the same area. And I was playing around with trying to do forced perspective on basically my scenery without structures. And so these trees and stuff are very small. Some are only an inch high. They're the very smallest little pine trees that I could find. And the aspen trees are basically just little bobs of foam that I put some glue on. The larger trees that are sitting here that I'm pointing out now are actually right adjacent to the small trees. In fact, the tree that I'm highlighting right now is probably sitting less than 2 inches away from these little small ones. But in order to make the visual trick work, is I put trees in the foreground that blocked your view, so you could not see where the big trees and the small trees were butting up against each other on that piece of terrain in the background. And so I was quite pleased the way that came out. I think it does a good job of communicating distance, even though these trees here are, like I say, just a couple inches apart. This is the track plan of the narrow gauge. It's kind of busy, so let me walk you through it. The town of Eureka, which is where the sawmill was located, I modeled it as a interchange point on the Rio Grande where the standard gauge met the narrow gauge, kind of like Alamosa in the real world. And so because I would had both gauges, all the yellow track here is laid dual gauge. And so I can have the confluence of the standard and the narrow gauge in my yard here. The dotted track that you see is track that I don't have in yet. So the railroad originates here in the town of Eureka. I've got a loop here that comes down. This isn't to scale, by the way, but there's a loop buried underneath the layout for continuous running. But when the train leaves the town of Eureka, it runs through the mining district and then to the Highline, the lower part of it. And when I talk about higher and lower, I'll show that in a minute. There's a mining scene that we go through, the Highline itself, over a trestle into the town of South Park. Okay, the track then leaves the town of South Park and it goes to an upper level in the mining area. And I will talk about that in a little bit. And it will eventually go to the town of Vail, which is on the upper level above the sawmill. So that kind of orients you. There's a few areas that I've highlighted on here that I will talk about in detail, but just to show you where they basically are on the layout. This is Eureka. Some of the buildings we'll look at, the Highline and South Park. This is the wider view of Eureka. We focused on the sawmill earlier, but the actual town of Eureka wraps around two sides of the sawmill. Here's some detailed views. The town, as I mentioned, is an interchange. So there's a lot of dual gauge track that I've built. And the dual gauge turnouts and stuff were all built using fast track jigs. I was actually the first one to order them. They didn't have them in the catalog at the time. And I think that I have the #1 set that they were done. So they're in the catalog now, but they were done as custom jigs at the time I bought them. And they worked out great. Turned out to be a real challenge doing the dual gauge turnouts because there's actually 4 varieties, which I hadn't really thought about at the time, but you take a standard right-hand turnout and there's 2 versions of it. You got one where the narrow gauge rail is on the right side, and then there's another one when it's on the left side. And so there were actually 4 different jigs that were required to do left and right. And they're not all equally difficult. The other thing too is I have areas where I have some of the turnouts are built up where in the case of the one that I'm highlighting here, it's dual gauge in one direction, but when you go off on the branch, it's just standard gauge where it interchanges with the standard gauge railroad. So the town area here is still in work, as you can see. I haven't done the back area since I haven't laid the rail yet. But looking at what I have done, here's some of the structures that are located in the town of Eureka. This is the wide scale miniature Opens Mercantile, which is one of my favorite kits on the layout. It's got a lot of character. I love doing a lot of the detail work. Another street scene. Most of the buildings on the layout I built myself. There are a few that I didn't build. The Bodines here in the front was built by Mark Evans, and I'm not sure if Mark is on the call today. For those of you that don't know Mark, he's a another modeler in Salt Lake. I've recently discovered I have a connections to a lot of the Salt Lake model railroaders that I didn't realize I had before. It's been over 50 years since I lived in Salt Lake, but at the SN3 symposium just recently, I bumped into Doug Jolly and found out that we were working on the railroad at the same time and hanging out. I didn't remember him and he didn't really remember me, but we were in the same place at the same time. Mark Evans, as I said, built this building. I was talking to him trying to negotiate a sawmill one time, or not a sawmill, but a roundhouse kit. And I mentioned that I spent a lot of time in Salt Lake on holidays, and he said, you know, I had an uncle that used to work for somebody named Dupler. And I said, well, that had to be my dad. We were the only Duplers in town. I said, but we liquidated my father's business all the way back in 1965. So I certainly don't remember who worked there or not, but my mother was still alive. And she said, maybe she will remember who your uncle was. And he said, my uncle was Raymond Anderson. And I said, that's my uncle too. So I found a new cousin in my model railroading. I have a new cousin in Salt Lake that I didn't know about. So, of course, I had to pick up a couple of the kits the buildings that he was selling because we had to keep him in the family. So if you're on the call today, Mark, here's how I'd be using one of your buildings. I like to light all my buildings. The joke I have is that if I ever have people over to run my layout and the trains don't run, I can always just turn out the room lights, flip on the structures light, and tell everybody that I'm modeling my railroad at night, and the trains don't run at night. So, but it's a lot of fun and a bit of a challenge to light up everything, but it can be pretty spectacular. Part of Eureka is an industrial area. Here's a couple of the structures that I've located. The one on the left is a Sierra West foundry kit. And the one on the right is one of their machine shop kits. I think that the foundry building is probably, I think, my best modeling. And I was really delighted the way it came out. It's a great kit. I love doing a lot of detail. As I said, a lot of colors, a lot of different materials, a lot of different textures. And this did a really fine job of letting me scratch that itch. This is the machine shop. As I mentioned, you can see it's got an interior in it. And again, a lot of detail with the workbenches, and it has a full interior. You can take the roof off, and the machine shop has all of the belt drive equipment installed. And it's kind of a pity that a lot of the buildings, when they're on the layout, you can't see that detail other than through some of the doorways and stuff. But it's a lot of fun building them, even if everybody can't always enjoy seeing them. I built a number of buildings getting ready for the mining district that I'm putting in. This is the Western Scale Models 20 stamp mill. This is the latest big structure that I've done. My mining area will also include have a propatria mill and the rags rose wall smelter. It'll be a lot of fun to build. And now we're getting into the Highline area. I had to do a cattle pen. Of course, we're talking Colorado narrow gauge. This is the same area where the logging line came through. This is, you can see the track. That's a standard gauge logging line passing through this area. One of the structures that I put in this part of the layout is this mine. This was built by my very good friend and fellow modeler, named Bill Sheaf. Bill passed away a few years ago. He was a fine modeler. Some of you may have seen his, he had his layout open for a couple layout tours and was in the Gazette. But he gave me this mine, and I just recently installed it on my layout that I like to incorporate where I can. As I said, I like to build all these structures. I had a mine identical to this that I'd already built up, but I like to kind of have mementos of my friends in the layout. And so I put his model in place of mine. And I think he would be happy the way that it turned out. I had to have workers for my mine, and so I have put some structures up here at the top. You saw them in a previous shot too, that it was intended to be housing for the miners. And so it gave me another little community that I can run trains through. And as I mentioned before, I wanted to have multiple towns and places for the trains to come and go through. Here's another overview of the Highline now. This kind of illustrates when I was talking about trying to visually separate the narrow gauge and standard gauge. The standard gauge and the narrow gauge are located probably 4 or 5 inches apart, running parallel to each other. But I've separated visually. The narrow gauge is all down here on the lower level. And if you look at it, you could see a narrow gauge scene without the standard gauge railroad intruding on the view. So for photography and things that I love to do is I can take shots of narrow gauge railroads without being adulterated by having shades and logging engines intrude on the scene. And then on the upper level up here is where the standard gauge trains ran. You can see there's the Skulls Forest sign, and you can see the logging camp up above. And just by lifting my camera up, I had to take all those shots that I showed of the logging camp in the logging areas, and you have no notion that the narrow gauge is in such close proximity. The Highline that we're looking at extends around the edge of the peninsula. Or I got a couple more shots here, excuse me. Here's another shot of the Highline area. The Highline extends around the end of the peninsula, and I've got a couple trestles located here. Some of you may have visited my layout in the early days of the 2012 narrow gauge convention, and I had a steel trestle located here. But I thought that putting in a wood trestle would give it a lot more character. Now we're coming into the town of South Park. This is the first craftsman structure I built, and I think it came out rather well. I think it's a pretty neat looking scene. The narrow gauge trains are right behind the fence here into town. Here's the town of South Park. I've tried to do quite a bit of forced perspective too here. The hillsides and stuff are all in scale. And again, trying to stretch the space visually. This is from the other side. This part of the layout dates back a number of years before I started doing photo backdrops. So this is one that I bought from, I think it was Backgrounds Warehouse. It's nice, but I like the newer one that I did. It's a little sharper and brighter, but this one does the job. So in the front here is the Dobbs. This is another one of the buildings that I got from Mark Evans. And so, as I said, if you're on, I want to make sure you get due credit. But Again, a few more scenes of the town. So Janice is kind of whispering behind me. She wants me to point out that, as I mentioned, Janice has been a big help in the layout. She cut all of these ties that you see. She made all of the trees that you see here in the layout. And she is particularly proud of the building. It's not the best shot of it, but she's also tried her hands at structures building. And so that's one of her buildings tucked in the trees. I should have put it in the middle of the picture to make her happy, but it's fine. So this is the right end. This is where the roundhouse is in the railroad facilities. The track going to the upper level comes out of from the depot and extends behind the roundhouse here and goes through the cutout up to the mining district and then to that new town of Vail that we'll talk about. The lower track here is actually a loop track that underneath the Highline area, I have a loop back that provides for continuous running of the standard gauge railroad. So it just goes in a tunnel here and comes out right next to where that little miner shack was, the little farm scene I showed. And again, I provided night lighting on all of the buildings in South Park. So if you haven't picked up on it yet, I really like structures building. And I've been building a lot of them. And a lot of them just, there is not a place to put them on my railroad, just because I wanted to try to keep it rural Colorado. But because I really like building all these buildings, I decided that I wanted to the way I fix the problem is I put an upper deck over the sawmill. And I said, this is going to be, let's face it, a warehouse for my buildings. But what I'm really going to model, and I've just kind of been mocking it up, is put in a city. And I'll have the train after it leaves South Park is going to come up through the mining district and come up, and it will be on the upper peninsula here. I probably won't have a lot of switch yards and other things, but I want to have a town to show off my buildings. And so these are some of the buildings that I've been building. And they would look way out of place in Eureka or South Park, but they're going to find a home up here in the town of Vail. I named this upper part Vail. I stole the name not from the city of Vail in Colorado, but I became pretty friendly with Jim Vail, who probably many of you have heard of, the late great model railroader and columnist in the Gazette. And I was able to purchase from his estate one of the buildings that he scratch built, and it's this white one in front. And it's a beautiful building. And as I said, I like building a lot of buildings, but I will put some on my layout that come from other people just because I want to honor their memory. And when I come in my train room and I see them, like the one here, I can think of my friends. And then this Miners Union Hall next to it, that's the last of the buildings that I got from Mark Evans. So in addition to doing structures, I've been modeling a number of cars. I've got a number of, call them novelty cars, ones that are detailed on the layout. These are some of them that I did. A number of these are kits that came from Sierra West, but I've scratch built a number of them also. But they give a lot of character too. With the standard gauge logging railroad, normally, you only have logging cars and you have cabooses. And I wanted to have variety of other cars that I could run on the layout that would spice things up a little bit. And these cars have such wonderful detail. And so, as I said, I built up about a dozen of them. For the rest of the railroad, right now, for the narrow gauge, I'm running pretty much exclusively Blackstone engines and cars. I've got quite a few brass engines and others, but if you want something to run, it's hard to beat Blackstone. I do have some brass on the layout. A couple I want to point out here is I have a K20, K28, K28 that came from a good friend of mine, Bill Sheaf, I mentioned. He's the same gentleman that built the mine building. And then I was also able to purchase an engine and some cars from Jim Vale's estate. And so I was able to get an excursion car. And so I've got the engine and the consist here that all came from Jim Vale. So I want to kind of end this presentation. This is my last slide, just by mentioning that, like all of us, is that I owe so much to other people in building my railroad and learning the skills to do it. And there are a few people that I want to mention in particular. There's my wife, Janice, who I've mentioned, and she's there busily building some trees for my railroad. Bill Black from Melbourne, Australia is a great model railroader and a good friend. And he has helped me out enormously by even being remote most of the time in Australia for trying to break me out of analysis paralysis. What you're looking at is where the logging area is and the log camp. And for 10 years, it sat just as track and plywood. And he was over here for a symposium a few years ago. And he said, you got to do something about it. So we got out the pink foam and he started cutting pink foam. And he's the one that basically motivated me to finish that part of the layout. Edward Richards and Bill Sheaf are two that helped me in the very early days of the railroad. Andrew Richards, Edward's brother, has been helping me a lot too on some of the things that are hard to get to. He's a lot bigger and a lot more abler than I am, and so he's a big help in doing things like backdrops and bench work and others. And in the lower right-hand corner is Mario Ratnet. I don't know how many of you know him. He passed away a few years ago. He's a gentleman that did the ModVid website that for years was the best website for fine scale modeling there was. And he came over here on a trip and basically is the one that taught me how to do scenery. And so I really appreciate their efforts. But anyway, that's my layout. And so I really like to thank you for taking an interest in it and for letting me share it with you. And so are there any questions?
Thank you, Barry. This is Robin. I appreciate you sharing that. If you want to stop sharing, that would be great. There are actually quite a lot of questions in the chat, Barry, so I'll go through these pretty well as quickly as I can. Jake Sweeney asks, what is the overall footprint of the sawmill complex? They look pretty large, right?
Right. So that peninsula is about 7 feet wide, and it's probably 8 feet, 10 feet. So it's a very large area because that has not only the sawmill, but it has the whole town of Eureka. It is really impractical. I know all about the 3-foot rule, but when I built that, as I said before, it was going to be crammed in a corner, and I said, you can't do that. I wanted to have the mill with a big log pond, and I had to have a track around it. And, that was a pretty hefty dimension. And I wanted to try to keep the shop areas near it. And I ended up with this large peninsula. I think it looks great. As I said, it's a pain in the butt to do track maintenance and stuff on it because there is a big lift out, which takes 2 people to lift out. But anyway, so it's about 10 by 7.
It's pretty big. I know I've seen it many times. Steve Hollenbach asked a question about, and I think it's referring to the mine camp. Who is the guy in the yellow shirt hanging on? Is he hanging on or climbing up?
He's the guy that wasn't paying any attention to you. I don't know if y'all picked up on it. I can go back and.
No, don't worry about it.
He's the guy that was hanging from the railing. So
okay.
I have a couple figures that I've put on there that are.
Steve is a safety engineer, hence the question.
Yeah, we all want more safety engineers. We know that. So,
Retired.
Right.
good. So another few great comments. Jake Sweeney says, nice scene details and building structures. Chuck Proudfoot says, great force perspective, which, yeah, that was great the way you explained that. Thank you. And Andrew Richards says, the backdrop matches the foreground really, really well. Very natural progression. That's cool.
I was very pleased with that.
Yep. And our safety engineer is back again. Anyway, he says, I really like Professor Fate's rocket car. That probably violates some rules.
Right.
There you go.
I'm glad you picked up on that one.
Yep. And Rich Wolfanger from Bradford, Pennsylvania, says, speaking of scratching the itch, I also built the Sierra West Foundry. Cool. And Warren Judge says, incredible model railroad. Love the detail and the overall effect that you have laid it out. I agree on that. And Phil Salinger says the same thing. A lot of nice detail in relatively compact space. Love the rock work. Rich Wolfanger again from Bradford says, beautiful layout. All your structures are excellent. And I love all the natural coloring throughout the areas. Cool. And Bill Hobbs says, you seem at least as interested in structures and industrial equipment as in the railroad itself.
You think so?
You're really interested in structures, aren't you, Barry?
Structures had turned out to be my first love. It wasn't that way going into it. I mean, I was a train guy.
Yep.
But I found that I'm spending more and more time building structures.
Yep.
And it's a good stress relief, and it's a little easier than crawling on, trying to bend over doing track work under that lift out when you have a second level 2 feet over your head hunched over trying to fix a turnout.
Gavin says from Singapore, says, very beautiful layout. Thank you for sharing. Blessings from Singapore. Can I ask you about your Sierra West kits? Did you model them and place them directly on the layout immediately, or did you create separate finished dioramas and then individually incorporate them into your layout?
It's a mix of both.
Okay.
That some of them were built in place, for example, the Sawmill. So the layout was built around it, but some of the other structures were built on boards on the size of the building, and then when I put them on the layout, I recessed them into the ground cover so that you can't see that they're sitting on a piece of plywood.
Yeah.
And so it's about half and half. You know, some of those you just can't set in place when they got all that detail. You have to do it on the workbench and then place the whole building on the layout.
Bill Hobbs says, I have the same problem with too many structures, and I'm trying to figure out how to do a Jim Vale, like an extension to display them in a finished scene. Yeah, some of us have too many locomotives, you have too many structures. There you go.
Well, Jim Vale had one advantage that I don't have, and that's I have a wife. And I don't know how many people
I'm going to think about that
ever
very carefully before I reply.
visited Jim Vale's house, but he had model railroads in every room and every closet of that house, and he just took over the whole thing, and it was incredible. My wife is
you and
trying to
Janice is
keep me
not
down
my
to one
wife,
room.
and you need to speak to her.
Yeah, I got the biggest room in the house, but so far she's not letting me boot the rest of the family out so I can take over other bedrooms. Yeah,
we'll work on that. Okay. And then finally, Dave Adams says, really cool that you've integrated Jim Vale and Railroad for all the right reasons. We often wonder if all the items Kate distributed are being put to good use, and clearly the answer is yeah, a lot of them actually are. So
Right, yeah. And I actually have one more building from him that I didn't show us. I got the big Vindicator mine that he had that will go in the mining district.
cool.
You know, I could build all those buildings, and as I said, at least one of them that I have from a friend, I built myself, but I put my friends on there. It's you learn so much, and you get so much from the other people in the hobby.
Yeah.
And when we have these wonderful layouts that are being taken down, it's kind of nice to get a piece of them. And I put them in my layout room. And when I go out there and I see them, I think of my friends. You know, I see the trees and I think of Paul Scholes, and I see the buildings, and I think of Jim Bell and Bill Sheaf. I've got a couple little things from J.J. Johnson, and from people that aren't gone, like Mark Evans. And it makes me happy that it just reminds me that, you know, I spend all my time by myself in the train room or with Janice. It reminds me that I'm part of a bigger community, and that I'm not just a total hermit. And like a lot of people think I am, that I've had. Yeah. So anyway, I won't go there anymore.
Okay. Well, no, I'll draw it to a close, but yeah, wonderful structures. We know you're fundamentally a structure modeler. We get that. By the way, we can see a fuzzy Janice behind you. Maybe you want to put her into focus so people can say hi to her. She's out of focus back there. And I'm hoping that if you guys come to the 2027 NMRA convention, which will be in the Seattle area, you'll be able to go and see Barry and Janice's layout. Oh, there's Janice. You can actually see her now.
Right.
And I need to end up by saying Janice is the best photographer. She wins all the prizes.
Yeah, so she does. She beats me on railroad photography. So for those of you that came to the 2012 or the 2022 convention, you've probably met Janice. Janice and I were the registrars, and so
yeah,
she was probably took your registration.
Yeah.
So
no, we appreciate that.
So
hey,
I appreciate her help.
Thank you, Baron Janice. We really appreciate.
I would like to thank all of you guys again for honoring me with letting me show you my layout. And it was a great privilege to be able to show it to you guys. And thank you very much. I'm honored.
And keep on modeling.
Thank you, Janice.